Okay, so America decided that with the Germans and the French and the British fighting each other, that they would, again, as I said last time, say they're going to make what they called blood money off of it, that they're going to be able to try to make money off this situation because warring countries need things. And America was more than willing to provide those things that they can make money off of. So, but as I said the last time, is that both the Germans and the British started to understand and know what America was doing, and they threatened them, especially Germany. Germany said that they basically would attack any ship that was going to supply their enemy with things that would help them in war, weapons or anything, food, clothing. And Wilson warned that Germany would, after Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson said that Germany would be held strictly accountable for any attack on American ships. Shortly thereafter, the Germans sunk a British liner called the Lusitania. There were Americans on it, not that many, but there were Americans on board the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a vacation cruise ship. It was on its way from New York back to Liverpool, England. Come to find out that the Americans did put some munitions on the bottom, not much, but they did put some. The Germans heard about it and they torpedoed the Lusitania, killing women, children, everyone, people who were on vacation. It's like sinking a cruise liner. Also, a couple other ships, the Arabic and the Sussex, were also sunk by Germans. Remember, unrestricted submarine warfare. That's what a German submarine looked like. They were very, very dangerous. They were hard to detect. We didn't have the kind of technology that we have today. And they could surprise attack you. There's a German torpedo hitting a British ship right there. You could see the dead wake, they called it, behind the torpedo. There's an artist depiction of the sinking of the Lusitania. There is the Lusitania there. Cunard was the cruise line name. The Titanic was also a Cunard ship. So they come to find out that the Lusitania carried over 4,000 cases of Remington rifle ammunition headed to Great Britain. 95 children and 35 infants lost their lives because of 4,000 rifle cases of rifle ammunition. All right, let's talk about the election of 1916. Woodrow Wilson was running for re-election against Charles Evans Hughes. He was being challenged by Hughes. It was a close election. He ran on these two idealisms. He kept us out of war and preparedness, basically saying that, hey, I kept you out of war. I'm going to continue to try to keep you out of the war. I can't guarantee it, but we're going to be prepared just in case we do go to war. So those are those two twin idealisms. He kept us out of war and preparedness. Wilson barely beat Hughes with 277 to 254 in the Electoral College. And it was the West that won it for Wilson. He got strong support in the West. When he went to bed that night, the night of the election, he figured that he lost. But then when the numbers started to roll in from the West, like California, Nevada, Idaho, Utah, they put it in his favor. Really, California was what won it for Wilson. So acts of war by Germany to really entice America into getting into it. They didn't want America to get into it, but you could see some desperation acts here. Wilson comes out and says he pleads for peace without victory, to no avail, though. Wilson was filled with idealisms. The world, according to Woodrow Wilson, hey, let's just stop fighting and have peace without victory. There's no way that was going to happen, but he threw that out there anyway. We'll talk about why he would oftentimes do this. There was a secret note written by German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann, and it was sent to Mexico, and it proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico. Basically saying that if Mexico were to attack the United States from the south, that later on, after the war was over, that Germany would help Mexico get all their land back from that they lost to the United States, including Texas and all of Mexican cession. So by proposing this, the German foreign secretary felt that if Mexico attacked the United States from the south, that would prevent the United States from getting involved in World War I and would open the door for a German victory. And then after they win, they come back and help Mexico get all their land back from the United States. That was the proposal. Well, it was intercepted, and it was sent to America, and it was published in newspapers, and it was getting people obviously fired up. The one thing, again, I have to mention is that there is no Pearl Harbor in World War I. What I mean by that is Pearl Harbor instantly united this country against the enemy for war. Before Pearl Harbor, Americans didn't want to go to war. The day Pearl Harbor hit on December 7th, 1941, America was all in. It was a unifying event. There is no real unifying event that got America involved in World War I. It's a number of things, like the Zimmermann note, like Germany's declaration of unlimited submarine warfare. Germany took a full page ad out in a New York newspaper warning Americans, don't get in any ships, cruise ships or other, in going to the Atlantic because it's open season out there. They declared unlimited submarine warfare. And obviously Wilson is saying, you can't do that. It's freedom of the seas. Then Germans sank 4 unarmed American merchant ships. And finally, Woodrow Wilson asked for and was granted a declaration of war in 1917. At first, he wanted the declaration of war before that, but Congress said, we're going to wait for overt acts by Germany. And the overt acts came in the sinking of 4 unarmed American merchant vessels. So he got his declaration of war. Interesting here. I always like to bring local history in. This is Main Street, Old Town, Salinas, right here. This is Old Town in 1917. It says here, Company C in Old Town, Salinas, on their way to the train station to deploy to Europe in 1917. Thought that was kind of cool. Wilsonian idealisms. I told you he was filled with them. He talked about peace without victory. That was never going to happen. He convinced Americans that if we get involved in World War I, it's going to be the war to end all wars. We'll never have to fight again. Obviously, we know that's not going to work. He said the world must be made safe for democracy. And he came up with his 14 points. All these are what people began to call Wilsonian idealisms. Pie in the sky. Wilson's vision of what should be. Remember, he oftentimes sounded like a preacher. Here he is addressing a rally in 1917 after the declaration of war. Let's talk about his 14 points. We're not going to talk about each one of them, but we'll look at 6 of them. The first 5, pretty important. This is the world according to Woodrow Wilson. Are they law? No, they're the way he wanted things to go. He talked about 1, open covenants of peace, no private, secret agreements between countries that could lead to war. He wanted 2, absolute freedom of the seas, based on what's happened with Germany and the submarine. He wanted the removal of all economic barriers. An economic barrier is a tariff. He wants no tariffs. He wants open international trade. He wants adequate guarantees of disarmament. He wants to see there be less weapons out there. He wants equitable colonial self-determination. What he means by self-determination is that one country should not be able to take over another country. Remember all that I told you before, the gasoline was being spread all over Europe. The gasoline came in the form of countries taking over other countries, imperialism, for whether it be economic gain or pride or prestige. it was happening all over the globe and it was causing problems. And Woodrow Wilson says a country should be able to say, no, we don't want to be taken over by you. You know, that's pie in the sky. It's never going to happen. But Wilson proposed it. And then, you know, a lot of other ones had to deal with specifically with geography. But number 14, really important for our purposes. He proposed that there be a general association of nations, a world peacekeeping organization called the League of Nations. This was his idea. This was his baby. This was what he wanted more than anything when he traveled to Europe after the war was over to sign the peace treaty, was a League of Nations, a world peacekeeping organization. So that was number 14 in his 14 points. Now, when it comes to getting this country ready for war and preparing them with the use of propaganda to get people on board, the Committee of Public Information played a huge role in this. The CPI, as it was known, was headed by George Creel, and it was a propaganda producing machine. They used pamphlets, posters, leaflets, movie ads, and mail to get people on board with fighting this war. The combination of George Creel and the Committee of Public Information plus Wilsonian idealisms whipped the country into a frenzy, and Americans expected the war to be easy and the war to end quickly and there to be very little death, much like the Spanish-American War, and everybody was going to be celebrating. And it would be like when you read a story when you're a little kid and at the very end it says, and they lived happily ever after. That's kind of cool when you're a little kid and you hear that at the end. You could, you know, you feel good about the story. That's what Americans wanted, and that's what they thought was going to happen. The CPI and Wilson got everybody worked up. Here they brought out from the Civil War, James Montgomery Flagg's depiction of Uncle Sam. It says, I want you for the U.S. Army. And there's a whole bunch of other World War I propaganda posters talking about stamping out the Hun, being the Germans, talking about rationing of food, donating money in the form of war bonds. All those were used. There was anti-German sentiment and paranoia all over the United States. Anytime we fight a war, whoever we're fighting against, oftentimes you get that anti feeling of whatever country we're fighting. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 showed Americans' fear and paranoia about Germans. Anybody found to be communicating with the enemy was going to be put in jail. There was the anti-war socialists were members of the labor union called the Wobblies, or IWW, International or Industrial Workers of the World, headed up by Eugene V. Debs, and many of them were arrested and sent to prison because they went on strike. They were anti-war. Now, the War Industries Board played a huge role in getting this country ready for war. They were in charge. Bernard Baruch, the leader of the War Industries Board, was in charge, huge job, of changing from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. That was going and convincing people like Ford that you're no longer producing Model Ts, but you're producing tanks. To companies that produce sewing machines like Singer, saying you're not producing sewing machines, you're producing guns. So that was big during World War I, and it had never happened before. It was an all-out total war involving everyone. So people would go to work in factories that were originally producing goods that weren't necessarily needed in war, but now they're producing war goods, changing the economy from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. The National War Labor Board, they made sure that they had a stable workforce. They made sure that people didn't go out on strike, and they warned people, if you went out on strike, then you're going to find yourself on the front lines. Former President William Howard Taft was in charge of the National War Labor Board. Women played a gigantic role in World War I. They filled in factories when men went to fight. After the war, though, women lost their jobs as men came back and reclaimed their jobs. It's going to be different in World War II. But a lot of respect was gained for women and what they did in their contributions in World War I, and it definitely helped with the 19th Amendment that passed in 1920, giving women the right to vote. women could join the Union. I'm sorry, women could join the military, but were in non-combat roles. They could work behind desks. They could transport troops to the battlefront, but they could not be drafted or serve in a fighting role. And then the Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act provided federally financed instruction on infant care to women, expanded the responsibility of federal government for family and warfare. This happened during the war to help women who were pregnant and were working. Another big important war committee that was created in Congress. All these are committees that are created in Congress, whether it be the CPI, Committee of Public Information, the War Labor Board, War Industries Board, and now the United States Food Administration. This was headed up by future President Herbert Hoover, and their job was to feed the world, really. At first, they started out saying we need to make sure that our troops have food, but pretty soon, when we're in an alliance with all these other countries, we needed to be able to feed the British and the French. They had meatless, heatless, and wheatless days. So on the meatless day, you wouldn't eat meat. On a heatless day, you wouldn't use fuel, coal to heat your house. Wheatless day, you wouldn't eat bread. And that was to try to conserve that food so it could be sent to Europe for the fighting men. And, obviously Herbert Hoover did a wonderful job here, and it propels him to the presidency later on. They were urging Americans to grow their own food. Victory gardens, they called them. The home front, war bonds financed this war. People donating money. There was a draft. Conscription law was passed, allowing the Army to grow to 4 million. Before the war, the United States was 15th in the world in size of army, behind Iran. At the time, it was called Persia. So they had a very small army, but then they started drafting people, and African Americans were able to serve, but they served in segregated units, and they do that in World War II, and it doesn't change until after World War II. So yeah, you had to register for the draft, and then a lot of men got drafted into the military to fight. The influenza of 1918. The Great Influenza of 1918, very interesting for us as we're in the middle of a pandemic right now, killed more people. The Great Influenza of 1918, so they called it the Spanish flu, killed more people than World War I. 20 to 40 million people worldwide. We'll never know the exact amount. Most likely, this started in a pig farm in Kansas, believe it or not. And then, the fact that we're fighting World War I gave the virus a perfect opportunity to replicate itself and pass from countries, and it was horrific. 1/5 of the world's population was infected. 675,000 Americans died. We're about 550,000 with COVID right now. That number is expected to go up. And they think that the Great Influenza claimed more than 675,000. We're looking at probably in the millions of Americans that died. African Americans, as I said, were forced to fight in segregated units. And when it came to the fighting in World War I, it was, should I say, a quick, the fighting didn't start for Americans, didn't get over there until really 1918. And the war is going to end in 1918. It's about 8 months of fighting. But in that 8 months, Americans are going to lose 60,000 lives in a short amount of time. And it's going to lead to Americans being upset at home because of the casualty rate. It was a high casualty rate. So back to this map right here. Remember, the Germans decided to attack France first and go get Russia second. But the Americans getting there, and the Germans got bogged down right here in this area on the Western Front. And there was a standstill right here, the trench warfare. And when the Americans started coming over, for a year before Americans came over, they used submarines to convoy goods over. They wanted really the the British and the French to be pushing back against the Germans before they ever set boots on the ground there. They really wanted that to happen. They didn't want to go into a desperate situation. So they sent weapons, food, and clothing over there to reinforce the troops. By the time the Americans got there, this line was pushing further east as the British and the Germans started to make some headway. When the Americans came in, they were like, if you're a baseball fan, you know what a closer does. He comes in the ninth inning and gets 3 outs for the win. And that's kind of what Americans did in World War I, is they were the closer here. And they really are the ones that get this going in the right direction with their convoy first and then on the ground second. It wasn't, it was horrific conditions, trench warfare. You see here, the Western Front. You see this taken at the end of the war, shows a boy terrified by the sounds of battle. You've got here's the Western Front right here that got continually pushed back before the Germans were enticed to surrender. Wilson enticed them to surrender, saying that they're going to be a fair peace. On the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the Germans surrendered. It was 11 o'clock on 11/11, November 11th, 1918, when Germany finally surrendered here. At the end here, here's the numbers of casualties. The Germans, almost 2 million casualties. The America with dead and wounded, 116,000. Russia was second, 1.7. In the middle of the war, Russia stopped fighting. They had a Bolshevik revolution in 1917, and they left the war. But they still had 2 million deaths, 2 million casualties in the war. All right, so Woodrow Wilson, at the time the war ended, was at his high point. Worldwide, very popular. At home, not so popular. At home, there were a lot of people mourning the death of 60,000 lives, 116,000 casualties. And so Wilson was, popular worldwide for ending the war, but at home was not very popular. So in fact, in 1918, in the congressional election, the Republicans got a victory. They had more Republicans than Democrats. Republicans took control in Congress. Wilson went to Paris to talk peace, as the Big Four were going to meet in Paris. He was obviously not very popular at home. Again, he is worldwide popular, so he gets there as a hero. One of the mistakes that Wilson made is he brought only Democrats with him. Should have probably brought some Republicans so they could have some say in what went on. He went with only his party members. So the Republicans were really upset about that. The Paris Peace Conference, there's your Big Four: Woodrow Wilson, Vittorio Orlando from Italy, Lloyd George from Great Britain, and George Clemenceau from France. There's your Big Four that are going to make the decision of what's going to happen in the peace treaty. Wilson's ultimate goal was the creation of the League of Nations, his baby. Little did he know that at home, there was a lot of people that were against the League of Nations, saying, why would we want to join a world peacekeeping organization whose philosophy is an attack on one, is an attack on all? Wouldn't that drag us into future foreign wars like this? Americans had a bad taste in their mouth from World War I, and Henry Cabot Lodge and Hiram Johnson and William Borah were our 3 senators, Republican senators, that were going around behind Wilson's back, because he's over there, doesn't know what's happening, and telling people that getting involved in the League of Nations would be a bad thing. Woodrow Wilson caught the Spanish flu in the middle of the peace treaty over in Paris. He was very, very sick, just like, people that have coronavirus get super sick. He was one of those that almost died. He was able to attend some of the meetings, some he could not because he was too sick. In the beginning, he was forceful that this has to be a fair treaty. It has to be fair to Germany, or else you're going to be dealing with an angry Germany later on. very thoughtful, very foreshadowing of the future for sure. He wanted to limit imperialism in the future. In the end, though, in order to get his baby passed, Article 10 or Article X, which is Article 10, which is the creation of a General League of Nations, he pretty much threw his hands up and says, do whatever you want. The British and the French are not happy with Wilson because he's saying we should go easy on Germany. And they're telling Wilson, it's easy for you to say that. You live thousands of miles away from Germany, and we need to teach Germany a lesson, so this will never happen again. And Wilson would tell them, be careful what you ask for. So in the end, the French and the British got their way. It was a harsh treaty on Germany, and it's going to cause the re-rise of Germany later on. Had Wilson been stronger in his conviction, maybe if he didn't catch the Spanish flu, I don't know, maybe things would have been different. The treaty blamed Germany 100% for the war, forced Germany to pay $31 billion in war damages, which would have come to about $440 billion in today's money. Germany was stripped of its military. They lost a bunch of territory. Austria-Hungary was broken up into two countries. The two countries that were created out of that land were Poland and Czechoslovakia. And the seeds are planted for World War II, definitely. Wilson came back. He still was not really healthy, but he was feeling better. And this political cartoon shows bringing her home to show the folks, and it's the League of Nations. He's so happy about the League of Nations. It's part of the treaty, and he's excited. What he doesn't know is, as you could see the frowns on these people's faces, is that they don't want to be part of the League of Nations. The Republicans were making sure that people knew that this was a bad thing. Here's the European map after the Treaty of Versailles, with the creation of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and land up here that became Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. So Wilson decided to take a tour when he found out that a lot of people were against his League of Nations. He was desperate, and you could see the desperation here. 8,000-mile tour, 40 speeches in 29 days. Here's the route that he took. I mean, he is zigzagging all over the country, and it's not like he's getting on a plane to do this. He's getting on a train and giving speeches everywhere. It was physically exhausting for Wilson, who was recovering from the Spanish flu and will eventually in Colorado get a stroke. He'll have a stroke here, and he will be very sick from the stroke. He ends up going back on another train to Washington, D.C. to try to recover. The rest of the entourage continued on and gave speeches until the very end. Woodrow Wilson was never able to recover from that stroke. He survived a few more years, but he was bedridden, and most think that his wife ran the country during that time. He was so bad from that stroke. Probably the Spanish flu contributed to it. Here you have a political cartoon, says League of Nations Covenant, and it's being blasted by William Borah, all these senators, throwing bottles and hatchets at it. They hate the League of Nations. At one point, though, they thought, okay, Henry Cabot Lodge, the Republican, said, if we attach these reservations onto it, we will allow it to go through Congress. And it would be basically Republicanizing the League of Nations, so that you'd have to get approval from Congress before you go get involved in a war because of the League of Nations. And Woodrow Wilson said no, or his wife said no. We'll never know what it was, but he refused to allow the lodge reservations to be attached. Consequently, they tried to get the Treaty of Versailles through Congress, but it was voted down. And why the United States failed to enter the League of Nations? Because of the Wilson Lodge feud, because of partisanship, Democrat versus Republican, because of traditionalism. Remember, it was George Washington in his farewell speech that said, we should never get involved in any more alliances. This would be an alliance. Isolationism, now we want to just bury our head in the sand and stay away from any foreign entanglements. Disillusionment from World War I, people were just flat out just done with World War I and the deaths, and it's disillusioned from what happened. Consequently, the United States never entered the League of Nations. So it was like a table with 3 legs without the United States. The world's most powerful country at the time didn't get involved in the League of Nations, so it had no legitimacy whatsoever. There's a picture of Woodrow Wilson in December of 1923, just before he died. Doesn't look too healthy. Doesn't have too good teeth either. Take a look at that picture. Okay, so in the election of 1920, the Republicans nominated Warren Harding, who was a really nice guy, but isn't going to be a great president. They wanted a guy just like Warren Harding, Americans did, someone who was grandfatherly. He looked grandfatherly. He was super nice. His vice president was Calvin Coolidge, which is significant because Harding's not going to make it through. He's going to die 3 years into his presidency. People were just fed up. No more Wilsonian idealisms. They were, tired of imperialism, tired of progressivism, tired of all this, big stick policy from Roosevelt. They just wanted to chill out. They wanted to go back to what it was in the good old days, which was about the 1890s. So Warren Harding offered them the perfect solution to that. The Democrats nominated a guy by the name of James Cox, and his vice president was Franklin D. Roosevelt, his vice presidential candidate. So there's his introduction into history right there. And then comes Eugene V. Debs for the 3rd or 4th time he's running. In the end, Harding wins. Finally, Solid South is broken in 1920. I told you that 1920 was the year. Tennessee, Harding wins Tennessee. It's going to go back to Solid South 4 years down the road, but there you have it. And that's the end of chapter 29.